Liquidation tends to happen quite a lot in the crypto market. So in today's video, I'm going to give you 3 tips to avoid liquidation. So before we get into it, what exactly is liquidation? So basically, liquidation is when you cannot meet the margin requirements. So usually what happens when we trade, usually with perpetual futures in crypto, we are using leverage and the broker allows us to trade with more position size than we otherwise would have been able to. So the way that we are able to do that is we have to put down what we call margin. So what happens is, as we're losing a trade, if the broker has no more margin to take from, he's going to say, listen, I'm going to have to close your trade because you don't have any margin left. And then when he closes the trade, that's known as liquidation. So now that we understand what liquidation is, I'm going to give you 3 tips to avoid liquidation. Tip number 1, don't over leverage. So what I mean by over leveraging is don't risk your entire account. Don't do 20x, don't do 50x, don't do 100x leverage. Because the more you over leverage, the higher your chances of getting liquidated. Because the more you leverage, so let's say you go 100x, what tends to happen is your liquidation price starts to get very close to your entry. Whereas if you were maybe only on 1x, the liquidation price would be a lot lower. So what are these tips without, a little bit of a story that can make you remember? So I remember when I first got into crypto and I was using these perpetual futures, and I think I was on FTX. So I think I was trading something called Sand Perp. So I was trading a Sand Perp, and I noticed, because FTX used to have this thing that said the winners for the day, percentage change, maybe it had a 200% change or something. So I looked at that and I was like, cool, let me take advantage of this. Now remember, I didn't quite understand how to trade yet or anything like that. So basically what I did was I put some crazy leverage. I don't know if it was like 20x or 25x leverage, because you go and you see online and you see all these people on TikTok and they're putting on these crazy leverages and they're making all this money. So I'm like, cool, I can do that too. So I did it, and I had a $600 account. And within a couple of hours, I had turned that $600 into $3,000. That's like more than 100% return over a few hours. So now you can imagine, I start seeing the Lambos, the penthouses, the private jets, because I'm like, well, if I can turn 600 into 3,000, surely I can turn 3,000 to 10, 10 to 100, 100 to a million, million to 10 million, 10 million to a billion. That's how we start thinking, don't we? Because we're like, wow. And you start thinking, you're Warren Buffett, or you're some really smart guy that's going to become a billionaire, right? What I ended up actually seeing is I started viewing the markets as a casino. I gave my brother a call and I said, hey, listen, I just turned 600 into 3,000. And so he's like, what? He was very surprised. So he sat down with me and we just started trading as if we were at the casino, like we do. Sometimes we like to take $100 and we like to bet. So we started going, and then suddenly we over leveraged again, another 25x. And in 5 minutes, that $3,000 went down to $200. I have never been so sad in my life. From seeing $3,000, something I didn't have, okay, because I over leveraged. Okay, so that was the good side of the sword. As they say, leverage is a double-edged sword. So the good side of the sword, I had got to $3,000. But now, with a lot of things, when it's a double-edged sword, as much as you get to enjoy the good, you also have to face the bad. So what ended up happening was, now leverage worked against me and turned my $3,000 into $200. And that was the day I learned a very important lesson. Don't view the markets as a casino and don't over leverage. Right, moving on to tip number 2. So tip number 2 to avoid liquidation is to use a stop loss. So some of you might be asking, what exactly is a stop loss? So a stop loss basically stops our position from getting worse than it could be. So let's say we are in a long position and we just bought something. So let's say I bought Bitcoin and I bought it on the perpetual futures, okay? If I use a stop loss, I minimize my risk, okay? Because let's say I bought it at 20,000. Maybe I put my stop loss at 18,000. So once it hits 18,000, I'm out the trade. So what a stop loss is it's basically a sort of order that you say, okay, once price comes to this order, I want you to basically take me out. So what that does is, let's say Bitcoin has decided for the next few months, it's going to go from where I entered 20,000 and it's going to go down to 10,000. Now, if I didn't have a stop loss, okay, I would lose from 20,000 all the way to 10,000. But because I had a stop loss at 18,000, I basically only lose from the 20,000 to the 18,000. And then from 18,000 to 10,000, I'm not losing because I'm out of the trade. Whereas someone else who hasn't used a stop loss is now in a lot of trouble. And by using the stop loss function, you're able to avoid yourself from getting liquidated. Let's say you were on BTC Perp, you were trading the Bitcoin perpetual, and you got in at 20,000, you put maybe a 5x leverage, and let's say for argument's sake, let's say that the liquidation price was at 15,000. So if you don't want to get liquidated, what you do is simple. You just put your stop loss above the liquidation point. Now, that's if you just, a newbie and you just don't want to get liquidated. But obviously, you need to also think about how much you want to risk per trade. So that's how you will take into account where your stop loss will be. So if you're a newbie trader and you just don't want to get liquidated, then just always put your stop loss above the liquidation price. But remember, just because you put it above the liquidation price doesn't mean you won't lose 90% of your money, because that's why I said that you need to think about how much you want to risk, and then that's where your stop loss should be. And then that way you will always avoid getting liquidated if you have that stop loss. So another story about stop loss. So when I first started trading, I believed I was always right. And I just thought, well, why do people put stop losses when all I can do is buy something, hold on to it? When it goes down, cool, I'm losing money. Eventually it'll go back up, and, then I never lost. Everybody else is out of their trade. I'm still in. But what we always forget when we trade or when we invest is we always think it can't get worse. We always think something can't go down by 90%, 95, 99%. Sometimes even it might be a rug pull and it goes down 100%. So that was the lesson that I really messed up on, was I invested in things and I didn't believe that they were going to go down to zero. But they did. And as a result, if I had just used a stop loss, I would have maybe only lost, let's say 20% of my account rather than 100% of my account. Finally, tip number 3, do not add on to your losing positions. So let's say, for example, you are in a Bitcoin trade at 20,000 and it goes down to maybe 15,000. So you're like, cool, I'm going to add on to this position because now I can make money from 15,000 to 20,000, and then my other 20,000 position and the other position, we can go together and make more money, right? That sounds like quite easy and simple, right? But the problem is when we add onto our losing positions, what happens is the broker now needs to take more margin, because now instead of us only being in one Bitcoin trade, we're actually in 2. So now the broker needs to take more margin. Now, because the broker has to take more margin, it means that our liquidation price is going to get closer to our entry. It's basically the same like over leveraging, because what we're doing is we've opened 2 contract positions instead of 1. So now our chances of getting liquidated are much easier. So I'm sure you're all waiting for a story about how I added on to a losing position. Well, unfortunately, I always used to over leverage to the point where before I even looked at a trade and said, let me add more to it, I was already liquidated. So I didn't even have time to add to that fire. And you'd actually be surprised at how many people don't actually abide by these 3 tips and end up getting liquidated on a regular basis. And if you want to learn what happens when lots of people get liquidated at the same time, then you can watch that video right over here.